I'm Aryeh Schwartz, and welcome to the Winsidr Show, where it's all about the W. Liberty take Game 3 in Minnesota in an epic fashion. I'm joined by Mitchell Hansen to discuss the epic Game 3. If you like our show, please consider joining our Patreon community, patreon.com/Winsidr. That's patreon.com/Winsidr. For less than a cup of coffee a month, you can directly show support for the hard work we do covering the W. And don't forget to see our amazing staff's written content over at winsidr.com. That's winsidr.com. Welcome back to the show. Excited to be here. I actually have two guests today. I'm joined with Minnesota Lynx specialist and beat reporter Mitchell Hansen, along with my daughter, Minnesota Lynx specialist, Golda. We got a lot to discuss. Before we get into it, we're getting to that point of the season. I want to remind all of our listeners we are doing a giveaway, partnering with Homage, giving away a WNBA team hoodie and a t-shirt of your choosing. All you have to do is email Aryeh@winsidr.com. That's Aryeh@winsidr.com, and share with us your favorite WNBA memory. Okay, Mitchell, you were there. You were live. While I get Golden to be a little bit quieter, tell me your thoughts, your reactions, just gut reactions. What was the vibe going into the game? And just give me the story of the game.
Yeah, I mean, it was electric at Target Center is what I think a lot of people expected. The fans showed out. I knew that it was going to be packed. I didn't know it was going to be like that. It gave me 2017 flashbacks of, the fans packing Williams Arena at the University of Minnesota, because at the time the Target Center was being renovated. If fans remember, during that season or that regular season, they played at Xcel Energy Center, which is the home of the Minnesota Wild. So it was a weird season that season, but last night Game 3 felt just like that, where the energy was off the charts. Lynx fans were going nuts. And what a series we have, what a Game 3 we had, but it was exactly the same as what we've seen the first two games with the home team getting out to a big lead, getting off to a strong first quarter. And then the other one battling back and tightening it up and evening it up. And, ultimately in Game 3, that went the way of New York. I mean, you got to give Sabrina credit too. That was a cold-blooded shot at the end of the game. Not only to hit that shot, but to hit it where she shot it and how that happened. I mean, it was just an ISO 3 from basically half court. Like, it was just a bomb. And she was kind of quiet for most of the first half, as the Liberty were in general. But I mean, you could throw in Brianna Stewart to that too. But both of them were kind of quiet in the first half, and they exploded in the second half. And it was kind of a flip of a switch and a flipped script too for both teams. So it was totally a fun game.
It was fun to watch. It was exciting to see live on TV. It was funny. I saw some analysis on that last play. I saw the post-game presser with Stewie, and it seemed pretty clear that was not what was drawn up. So I do want to, a lot of people are trying to clown on K-Mac for letting up that shot. Let's be clear. Minnesota played proper defense there. And then New York responded with, Minnesota played good defense, let me say. And Sabrina found a way to create a better shot versus good defense. Better always beats good. Very much flipped the script. And we talked about it, going into the game, the only quarter points per game from the first two games that New York was leading Minnesota was the first quarter. And so going into this game, you had to think Minnesota, 10-point lead after one. Great sign for Minnesota. But then they don't win another quarter this whole game, 26-19, third quarter. Third quarter has historically been New York's worst. It was Minnesota, really struggled, could not take advantage of that out of the half. It seemed to me, talk to me about the juxtaposition between the first half and the second half for a moment here, and what you think kind of was the difference on the Minnesota side and on the New York side.
I think Minnesota, and this is, this has been their success all season long, but they were playing so well defensively in the first half. I know I've heard you and Rachel talking about it over the first two games of this series, that their defense, Minnesota's defense, feeds into their offense, and that was especially the case in Game 3. And that was the biggest reason why they jumped out to a lead in the first quarter and in the first half in general. But Minnesota was playing well defensively. They were turning New York over. They were turning that into points on the other end. And then you saw Kayla McBride and Bridget Carlton just kind of go off in that first quarter and for most of the first half as well, which that hadn't happened really in this series. That wasn't the case in games 1 and 2. But Minnesota was rolling in the first half. They looked like they were playing free. They looked like they're playing Minnesota style of basketball, which we can't really say. Leading up to Game 3, we couldn't really say that throughout the first two games, despite Minnesota winning Game 1. But in the second half, it ended up being, I think, it was a mixed bag of everything. It was just kind of a big storm of things that could go wrong for Minnesota. They, weren't as great defensively, making mental errors offensively. You could throw the officiating into that. That obviously didn't play or that didn't help Minnesota by any means. And then you have the play of Breanna Stewart and Sabrina Ionescu, who they were unreal. Especially late. So it was a mix of everything. But to your point about the quarters, that's something that we haven't seen from Minnesota this entire series. I mean, you look at the first two games, it was the exact opposite of what we saw in Game 3. Minnesota had a rough first quarter, but they owned the rest of the game, basically. And last night in Game 3, it was just completely different. And I don't know what's in the water with road teams, but it's you can never count them out, which is usually the other way around. But it's been fun.
The craziest thing to me was throughout this game. I mean, look, Sabrina, rightfully so, is going to get a lot of credit for that shot. She takes an ISO, a good defender. She creates a look on a night where she was not having her best shooting. She drops 13. She goes 5 for 12, 3 for 8 from the 3-point line. But Breanna Stewart, I mean, just putting this team on her back and willing them. Look, we can argue about a few questionable calls. We can argue about what, at the end of the day, and I said this to you before, and I said this to Rachel, and sorry, Rachel's a little bit busy prepping for college basketball. She got some big things. I know she's excited to announce, but, it very much seemed like New York was making the shots to win the game, and Minnesota was struggling to hit those shots. The officiating was bad. It was horrible. It's been horrible all series. I tweeted after the first game, this is some of the worst officiating in a game I've ever seen. The ref said, hold my beer. Let me step it up. Let me step it up. And they've been doing a great job of that, if that's what you're into. Look, there was horrible calls after horrible calls. I couldn't help but watching the post game. They were showing Stewie's stats next to Fee's stats, and it's like they shot basically the same, right? They got so many similar things. Why did Stewie have 8 more points? Well, because Stewie had 6 more free throws than Fee. And so if I'm a Lynx fan, I'm obviously very frustrated at the officiating. If I'm the Minnesota team, I'm very frustrated with the officiating. You look at the beatings that Alana Smith has taken over this season and in this series. One of the toughest players in the league, and definitely one of the toughest players in this series. What we saw yesterday, a player who was clearly physically, visibly in pain, but struggled through it, fought through it, had by far the best plus minus in the game. Couldn't hit shots though, because she didn't have her, like when your back is hurting like that, it's hard to make the shots. It's hard to get your legs behind it and do those things. But she was still able to facilitate. She was still able to assist her team in ways they truly needed. Personally, I would have liked to see Minnesota go with some different lineups and things. So maybe get Dorka some run a little bit there, especially when the injury has happened. I'm curious your thoughts on that, and then we can dive in a little bit more on the New York side.
Yeah, kind of going back to Alana Smith, like to your point, she's been banged up this whole series. I mean, she's had the ankle issues that kind of stems back to the semifinal series against Connecticut, but she's had some ankle issues. She obviously had the back stuff last night, and you look at also with the fact that she's maybe not 100%, or that she obviously wasn't in Game 3. She's also going up against Jonquel Jones, which is no easy task when you're fully healthy. So the fact that she was kind of able to some extent, kind of control what Jonquel was able to do on that end, I think was impressive. And Alana Smith just does a lot of things that, don't necessarily appear in the stat sheet or the final box score. I mean, she's not going to, drop 20 points, and she can, but she's, usually not the type of player that will drop 20 points and wow you with her offensive game, but she does all the little stuff that makes a big difference. She's great defensively. I do agree to the extent of, whatever the injury might have been with Alana Smith. I understand leaving her in, but I also agree that it would have been, I think, at least worth a try, even if it's a couple-minute run with Dorka Juhas to see what you have there. At least that gives you a little bit more of an offensive threat. Defensively, you take a little bit of a hit if you do throw her in there. But, I would have liked to see that. Or maybe Minnesota goes small ball. Maybe they throw Fee at the 5 and then they go small, like we saw a little bit in game 2. I agree. I think, it could have been, something that happened, but or kind of a switch up. But then you take the risk of Jonquel going off. And that's kind of what we saw in game 1 specifically of her having her way for most of the game. But New York's just a tough team to stop. They have firepower all over the place, inside and out of the paint. And they're just it's kind of pick your poison when it comes to them.
And it was something that I noticed in game 2 was that if Minnesota's not going to win the bench production argument, that's going to be a huge, we know the star power of Liberty. The Liberty are a team that was built to win championships against the best teams in the league. They compiled 2 of the best players in the league, an up-and-comer, and some other role players who have fit in perfectly onto this team. And then you have one of the best point guards in league history. So they really combined together. And I kind of went off on a tangent there, but Brianna Stewart's night last night was insane. Talk to me about the poise, the preparation, and just the living in the moment that you saw from Stewie in that game.
People talk about players getting into, that mode, quote unquote, that mode where they're, everything's rolling and they're just in the zone. That is exactly what you saw from Stewie last night in game 3. She was just, every time down the floor, she wanted the ball and she was going to score. Whether that be with the help of the officials or anything else that she was doing offensively. But she was on a mission, and it seemed like every time that Minnesota did something on their end offensively, you were waiting to see what would happen from Brianna Stewart on the other end. And it just seemed like an inevitable that she was going to answer back. But to do it on the road, to do it on that stage, to do it in game 3, the series tied 1-1, down 15, trying to get your team back in the game, it's an impressive performance. And the fact that, she was able to, I think she dropped 22 of her 30 in the second half. That's quite remarkable. And she's one of the best in the game for a reason. And, she kind of owned it in game 3.
Well, that was the thing. And that's why you have superstars. That's why you have a player who averages the most points in finals history. What Stewie was able to do to carry that team, because there were so many points. Look, throughout the first half, Minnesota dominated it, but they weren't able to hit enough of their shots to make it that crazy extended lead that maybe they could have survived. As the game went on, I kept looking at the box scores. I kept watching the game and thinking to myself, this is the type of game Minnesota wants. Defensively, they were able to get in a lot of passing lanes. They didn't have so many turnovers. They were able to get out in transition and make good looks. They were getting, some wild hands through passing lanes. They weren't letting players get comfortable in their zones. But Stewie just would not. She was relentless. She would not give up. It was one of the more impressive singular performances I've seen from a player. Now they've adjusted it and she only has 4 blocks, I think they're saying now, but 30 points, 4 blocks, a steal, an assist, and 11 rebounds. Just a wild game. The craziest thing, maybe, her plus minus, she was -2. I don't know how that happened. It was just ridiculous. But you look around and you're thinking to yourself, this is what Minnesota wanted. The problem is You had issues with Alana Smith being able to produce points, right? So if you're looking at New York, just a points production wise, New York, Stewie gets 30. Jonquel, Phoebich, Sabrina all add 13, and just 2 from Benijah. So if you're on the Minnesota side, you're like, okay, Fee's gonna, compete with Stewie. McBride's gonna go off a little bit. Courtney's gonna get some points. Bridget Carlton was that player that, for me, I have not seen her be aggressive enough yet so far this series. And the Lynx have had so much success when she's been aggressive. She's found ways to score around bigger opponents in Jonquel Jones, Phoebich, and Stewie. And so, there was points where it seemed like almost the moment that BC started to get going and be aggressive and attack, that's the moment where this team it looked like they got back in control at times in the fourth. They weren't able to extend that lead. They weren't able to make that into a point where, hey, let's run away with this. But look, first of all, it was an amazing game. The game ends with 1 second left with a half-court shot from Sabrina. And let me be abundantly clear, because I've seen some people talking about this. I'm sorry, the New York Liberty have never won a finals. That was the biggest shot in New York Liberty history. If they win the finals, yes. If they don't win the finals, I still think it's the biggest shot in New York Liberty history. I'd have to go back and rewind and look at it, but I'm sorry. If you're trying to argue and compare it to a shot that similarly didn't win a championship, no. I just think that was by far, in the moment, given everything that's happened this series and what we've seen, that was the biggest shot. Naira Sabali, also impactful, 11 minutes, 2 for 4. Shockingly, only 1 rebound, 1 steal, 1 block with 4 points. The depth of New York, I think, if we're going to be sitting here talking about, Minnesota's depth, it comes down to how are other teams going to combat that? And New York did such a good job combating Minnesota's depth and being able to kind of not just control the pace of play in the second half, but the ability to rest your star players and have bench players come in and still control the pace of play is so important. It is so defeating for the home crowd. I don't even know where to go from this. I mean, it was such an emotional high and low and high and low throughout this whole series for fan bases of both sides, for media members covering the league, covering these teams. I guess, where is your head as we are getting ready, just X amount of hours, fill it in from when you're listening, from Game 4 of the finals in Minnesota? Is this a case of Minnesota has been broken and they are gone? Do you think Minnesota makes a rush in Game 4? And where do you see this series going?
I've predicted before the series that it would go 5, and I say that with expecting each team was going to win a game in each location. So to me, it's kind of where I thought it would be to some extent. I think for what happened on the side of New York last in Game 3, I think that the way that Minnesota kind of held them in check for the most part, that was their opportunity. And I think that was an opportunity that was wasted. Not saying they can't come back in Game 4, but if they win Game 3, I think Minnesota has a really good chance of winning Game 4. And now, I mean, I still think Minnesota's going to win Game 4. I think they'll bounce back and force a Game 5, but it's going to be a whole other ball game when you're playing in Brooklyn than it would be if you're playing in Minneapolis. But I do think, you could argue, New York missed an opportunity in Game 1 too, but you could argue for both teams. But I think Minnesota missed the opportunity in Game 3. But I do expect them.
That makes me want to ask, like, what was more of a letdown or disappointment? Minnesota losing Game 3 or New York losing Game 1 in the fashions that they each happened?
I'd say probably Game 1, just because of how it happened. It was kind of I don't know. Both of them are disappointing, but I would say maybe New York, or that Game 1 in New York.
Has there been a game that happened that has completely shifted your belief on how the series would go before going into the series, and you thought it was going 5? Was there a singular game that happened, and it sounds like maybe it was last night, but was there a singular game that happened that kind of has shifted your view on it? Because for me, and maybe this is because I'm from Minnesota and my bias is showing. I've watched this game, and I think we haven't seen a complete game from either team, no question about it. But I think we've seen more in line with what we've seen all season from New York, and that being allowing teams to be close enough to win. I've watched a lot of New York Liberty games. They allow teams close enough to win, but because of their star power, because of their vet presence and who their players are, they're able to pull those away in clutch moments. We saw in game one and throughout the whole season, Minnesota takes advantage of those clutch moments. If you give them opportunities, they take advantage. They did that in game one, not in game two at all. Game three, they did it for part, but not enough. And you could feel it. I don't know if you could feel it in the arena, but I feel like watching the game as it whittled down, you could feel that it wasn't going to be that game where Minnesota just, calm, cool, collective finishes it off. If it was going to happen, it was going to be exciting and energetic, and maybe it will. But it didn't have that feel that we've had all season long watching the Lynx saying, we know this is going to happen. So back to my question, has there been a game that shifted it? And for you, what will be the deciding factor for both of these teams to win?
I think for me, the game that before game three, game one was absolutely a game that shifted or kind of swayed my prediction or kind of how I thought it was going to go. I thought Minnesota, with all the momentum, I thought maybe it'd go 4 games. Minnesota would win 2 in Minnesota, and then they obviously had that game 1 victory. Now, after seeing game 3, New York just looks very poised. They look like a team that's been there, and they have. I mean, we talked about it before the series. You and I did that. The experience will play a factor. In Minnesota, they don't, with the exception of maybe Courtney Williams and Natisha Heidemann, I think and Kayla McBride, they don't really have any deep playoff experience. They don't have any finals experience, and that's where I think you see, in times when. Now in game 1, that didn't matter. They normally a team that doesn't have experience or that fits that bill, they would fold easily in game 1. Minnesota didn't do that, but in game 3, I think we saw it a little bit more where the role players, and you just have to be so consistent throughout the game and supporting cast outside of let's just say Nafisa Collier and maybe Kayla McBride. The surrounding cast, they haven't played, to your point, like a complete game or played their style of basketball. And maybe that's credit to New York, and maybe that's credit to what they're doing defensively. But, and that's where the experience, I think, comes into play a little bit. It's those big moments where, in these games, the littlest issue or littlest, mistake can cost you a game. And we saw that in game 1. We saw it in game 3. New York kind of fed that, or kind of held that off in game 2. But moving forward now, I do expect Minnesota, just knowing the coaching staff, knowing Cheryl Reeve and how good they are at in series adjustments. I expect Minnesota to bounce back. If they have more of a Minnesota style of game in game 4, like what we've seen throughout the postseason to this point or throughout the regular season, that might sway things back a little bit towards Minnesota for me, in that, maybe they could win a game 5 on the road. But if you had to ask me right now what I think will happen, I think Minnesota wins game 4. I think it goes back to Brooklyn for game 5 and New York pulls it out, and I think it'll be close either way, but just that experience factor. And like I said, it seems like New York has that look in their eye. They have that poise, and they are determined, and they know what it takes to cross the finish line. And I think this is probably the year that they do so.
Yeah. And look, that's why New York has been favored. That's why New York was the favorite to win it. I think going into the series, because Minnesota had New York's number during the regular season, you look at it and you try and dissect all the different angles and discuss all the different whatevers. I agree with you. I think Minnesota has had opportunities. They haven't taken advantage of it. And New York has that look. It's going to take something unique, special, and great from Minnesota. And I'm going to be honest, New York did not have that look in their eyes in game one. They didn't, in my opinion, did not have their look in their eyes in game two.
Mm-hmm.
Last night was the first time that I saw the look in their eyes where it's like, and maybe it was, a camera that caught Fee calming the team down at a certain point. Maybe it was Stewie caught on camera saying, we're not going to effing lose this. Whatever it was, I completely agree with you. Would I be shocked for New York to come in and win in Minnesota? Not completely. I think I would be more shocked to see Minnesota win game 5 in New York. That said, every game has really, in my opinion at least, really shifted my perspective on what's going on and happening. And so I don't want to sell game 4 short. I think game 4 could very well be enough of a win for Minnesota that, we start talking about this in a different situation. But I think it would take the first dominant win of the series for Minnesota, for us. And I'm not saying Minnesota can't do it. And I'm not saying that this is an impossible task or, in the same way after game 1, I was sitting there and going, I said before the series, I said Minnesota in 4. And I think that's right, because there's no way Liberty are getting swept, but also Minnesota has their number and they're cool, calm, and collective, and they're ready for the moment, and experience be damned, we're doing it. That's the same way that, I've shifted throughout. And now I'm sitting here going, for Minnesota, you need to win confidently, handedly in game 4 to show the fight. And you need to almost do that to show the fear that New York should have, because New York's not afraid of anything right now. New York is they're too comfy. They're kicking their feet up in Minnesota's home court, and that cannot be okay. You have to think at a certain point in that second half last night, I just keep replaying it in my head. Like I don't know. They didn't try enough. I would have liked to see them try something different, but also at the end of the day, I view a lot. I know there's a lot of it factors and what if this happened different and blah, blah, blah. Minnesota delivered defensively for the most part what they needed to. Mm-hmm. They held New York to 80. Minnesota should be able to score more than 80. And Bridget Carleton needs to be aggressive. On the other end, look, New York has kind of played the Minnesota style to win when they need to, right? Like someone needs to step up. Lainey Hamilton steps up in that one game they needed last game. Before that, JJ stepped up or Sabrina stepped up. Somebody's always stepped up, and that's kind of the MO Minnesota's had. And in these last 2 games, Minnesota's been looking for someone to step up at the right moment, and nobody has. I want you to pick one X factor on each team for game 4, and then give me your finals prediction, your last shot, man.
I think you kind of touched on Bridget Carleton, so I won't say her on the side of Minnesota. I really think the key might be in the paint. I think it might be Alana Smith versus Jonquel Jones and what happens at that battle. You talked about it before with, you have Fee and Stewie that kind of even each other out to some extent. They're going to go back and forth. They're going to get their stat lines that they do. They're going to lead their teams. You have Courtney Williams and Sabrina that will do what they do well, leading the team as floor generals. But then you have that supporting cast. You have you have Bridget Carleton, you have Alana Smith, you have, Benanja Delaney Hamilton, you have Jonquel Jones. Like those 2 on each side, I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens in game 4, because I think that'll be a key aspect. And then, I heard you talking about it before game 3, after game 2 with Rachel on this podcast, that the bench just needs to, I admittedly thought Maisha Hines-Allen was going to have a bigger role than what she has, or play a bigger role than what she has so far. And, maybe that's maybe it's a minutes thing. Maybe it's, she doesn't have enough time to get into the game and get in her rhythm. But regardless, I thought that Minnesota's bench would produce a little bit more than it has. And that's kind of been a downfall too, because we've seen it in the past where the starters aren't rolling. Maybe Bridget Carlton's not rolling. Kale McBride's having a quiet night. That's when you see Maisha Hines-Allen and Natisha Heidemann come off the bench and surprise people. Or you have Xander Lassini coming off and hitting a couple threes and lifting this team. So that's something we haven't really seen so far. And that's something that I'm really keying in on. And for on the side of New York, I think an X factor is Jonquel Jones. You look at, I kind of mentioned now she has a matchup that maybe the person on the other side's not 100%. Maybe she's dealing with somebody off the bench a little bit more, or she's seeing new players, new faces, whatever it may be. We saw her dominate in game one, and I think that's something that, Minnesota's obviously going to know New York's going to want to do that, but I think that's something that the Liberty need to try to do is feed her. Because that only opens things up for everybody else on the outside. So that's a long answer of what I'm kind of looking for on both sides. And ultimately, I do expect Minnesota to win in game 4. I think they'll bounce back. I think they'll come out on a mission. Now, it's one thing to win, and it's one thing to win convincingly or in a fashion that we know Minnesota can win. And to your point earlier, that's what I'm watching for too. I expect Minnesota to win, but I want to see how they win in the way that they do so, because that'll be telling for what happens in game 5. If Minnesota can win in a convincing fashion, let's say they continue throughout 4 quarters what they did in the first quarter of game 3. If they win that way and they win with on both ends of the floor, I think they have they could carry the momentum into New York. But if they squeeze one out, if they don't look they don't look great, but they still come out with a win, which is the most important thing. I could see New York pulling away in game 5 in Brooklyn. But so I think it's almost more so on Minnesota. It is on Minnesota. Their backs are against the wall, but I think it's more so what do we see from the Lynx? And that's the most important thing for me, I think, going into game 4 and for the rest of the series, however long it lasts.
Love it. I'm agreeing with you on all of this. Please, real quick, tell me, who's your GOAT?
I gotta go. I'm gonna go back off of Rachel in the previous podcast. I gotta go Money Moan. Money Moan's my GOAT.